coming up.
Because of the duties in the adversarial environment that we're in by design, how do we rationalize what is feeling uncomfortable through harassment or feeling uncomfortable because you just got political pressure put on you in an adversarial system?
So what would be the recourse for a member of parliament who is undergoing harassment by another member? What would be their recourse at this point?
I want to follow up on the line of MP to MP harassment. And when it was asked about social media, I think, Mr. Jantz, you said that's a separate matter or a separate subject, except my question is, what happens when an MP puts on social media something that directly drives harassment of the MP? So they mention another MP specifically in social media, which in turn drives phone calls, emails, and social media threats and misogyny. And I've been subject to that repeatedly.
I will say, because it's a matter of public record, that I think I was the first case of criminal harassment that was prosecuted on Twitter writ large.
So that a member now is refraining from either going to the chamber or participating in debate or self-regulating what they say out of fear of all of that happening.
Online criminal harassment, or perhaps additional tools that law enforcement could use, or that there's a gap in right now.
Cyberbullying, threatening, spreading rumors, or negatively talking to or about someone online or on social media, socially excluding or isolating someone, persistently criticizing, undermining, belittling, demeaning, or ridiculing a person, psychological harassment. I'm picking out the ones that I think are most pertinent to our discussion here today. Sexist remarks, racist remarks, homophobic remarks, transphobic remarks, verbal threats or intimidation.
I wanted to ask about witnesses. We are seeing witnesses not come forward as much at committee. We are also seeing this clipping culture, these gotcha politic moments.
We also have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is premised largely upon the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which gives us freedom of speech, freedom of expression.
My office is closed all the time now, except by appointment.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
We have a number of familiar faces with us here as witnesses today, so I would like to welcome Eric Jantz, Clerk of the House of Commons, Michel Bédard, Law Clerk and Parliamentary Counsel, Carolyn I had it, Carolyn. I had it. We talked about it. Evangelides? Did I get it? Close enough. Evangelides, that's it. Evangelides. You said let it roll off the tongue, and I didn't. There it is. Evangelides. Thank you, Mr. Calkins, who is the Chief Human Resources Officer. We have Patrick McDonald, who is the Sergeant at Arms and Corporate Security Officer, as well as Jeffrey Leblanc, the Deputy Clerk of Procedure. Colleagues, we will now begin the first round. As you know, each party will have 6 minutes. Mr. Calkins, I believe you're the first up, so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for always coming to this committee whenever we need to hear from you. I guess I will let you decide who is best positioned to answer the question based on the nature of the question after you hear it. So I just want to be clear about the jurisdiction. So understanding jurisdiction here. The jurisdiction of the members of the House of Commons Workplace Harassment and Violence Prevention Policy. What is that jurisdiction?
The jurisdiction for that is largely members as employers. So it targets largely the employees of members.
And it does not deal with member-to-member interaction. Just so we're clear.
That's correct.
Who would have jurisdiction to make a decision about anything that happens between members? Where is that jurisdiction?
I'll maybe turn this one over to Michel, but I think that's where there's a bit of a void.
The House will unquestionably have the jurisdiction to govern the conduct between members to members and put in place a regime as it did for sexual harassment.
Right.
And the House, for such matters, will oftentimes act on the recommendation of PROC, and actually the first order of reference to this committee in 2014 contemplated that the study and the ultimate code will cover all form of harassment, but ultimately the report only covers sexual harassment. Now, if Boy was to put in place a regime that were to intend to apply members to member, it could work in a certain way, but Boy's authority is limited. So, for example, any disciplinary measures will have to be confirmed by the House if we're talking about suspensions or any other sanction that requires a decision from the House. But unquestionably, this committee has the authority to make a recommendation on member-to-member harassment.
So that's a bit of a challenge, obviously, because the chamber, the House, is designed to be adversarial. So can any of you offer members of this committee any advice on the definition of adversarial versus the definition of harassment? Because it's designed to be that way. And members of Parliament do feel uncomfortable. We're made to feel uncomfortable by our constituents. We're made to feel uncomfortable, and we shouldn't feel comfortable in our jobs. This is the nature of our democracy. So in the delineation of feeling uncomfortable because of the duties in the adversarial environment that we're in by design, how do we rationalize what is feeling uncomfortable through harassment or feeling uncomfortable because you just got political pressure put on you in an adversarial system?
It's a very good question, Mr. Calkins, because you're right. The House of Commons is a very unique workplace with a very unique mandate, as you just described. So any definition in terms of what is acceptable, I guess, the acceptable roles of members in the House, either on the government side or opposition side, versus what falls into the area of harassment is something I would anticipate this committee would want to reflect on if it was decided to go that route. And I think any regime, if one was to be put into place, would have to take into account the fact that proceedings in the chamber and in committee are overseen by parliamentary privilege. Maybe, Michelle, you want to expand a bit on that?
Yeah. If I may, there are some jurisdictions that have adopted a code of conduct.
Sure, I'm having a hard time hearing. Can you move your microphone, Mr. Bedard?
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it better this way?
Hope so.
Okay. There are some jurisdictions that have adopted a code of conduct that will apply to all form of harassment, but they carve out parliamentary proceedings. So, for example, the Senate has a policy that will apply to conduct between senators, but it does not apply to all actions that are taking place during parliamentary proceedings. Everything that is taking place during parliamentary proceedings will be addressed through the procedural means that are already available, be it a question of privilege or question of decorum, that are usually enforced by the chair or the speaker.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So my last question is then, what constitutes the parliamentary area? Just for clarification, the House of Commons obviously does, a committee space does. Our offices and any place in the parliamentary precinct, what about our constituency offices?
Normally, in terms of parliamentary proceedings, in terms of privilege, it's just the House, the chamber, and committees.
Well, we can attend the chamber from our constituency office. We can attend the chamber from our house. We can attend the chamber from anywhere in Canada as long as we have an adequate internet connection.
Yeah.
This needs to be clarified.
Yeah.
The concept of parliamentary proceedings will exist whether you participate in proceedings through virtual means, through Zoom, with the video conference as authorized by the House. So the jurisdictions that have applied harassment to all conduct will have carved out the parliamentary proceedings. That I gave the example of the Senate, but there are other examples in Canada that have carved out parliamentary proceedings from the applications of their code of conduct or policies when it applies to members to members.
See, I don't differentiate.
Mr. Calkins will have
Sorry.
to wrap up right away.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
So what would be the recourse for a member of parliament who is undergoing harassment by another member? What would be their recourse at this point?
Thank you for the question. So as it stands today, we're always encouraging, we really review it case by case, right? So you are able to come forward and actually speak to us, and it really depends on the situation. We also work very closely with the Sergeant at Arms to ensure from a safety perspective. So I think, that's our first line of defense is reviewing every case, making sure that the environment is safe from a physical safety perspective. Then what we do is, should it be under the Code of Conduct sexual harassment, then we go that route. If it is not, then we actually refer you back and with a whip. And there, yeah.
I'm going to cut you off because I have lots of questions, so my apologies.
Yeah.
So not dealing with sexual harassment, not physical safety. What I'm talking about is, say, psychological harassment. And my home province of Quebec was one of the leaders in terms of bringing forward legislation to prevent workplace psychological harassment. So right now, there is no recourse really available. And from what I understand, there is no even mediation available to members of parliament that are undergoing psychological harassment. Is that correct?
There's always, Phil, thank you for the question. There's always an opportunity for the member HR team to actually provide any type of support. So there are external resources. There's coaching available for you. It's just the recourse is not there, as you mentioned.
And you mentioned that in the event of a situation, a member can go to their whip. Do whips and deputy whips of caucuses receive basic human resources training or harassment prevention training? And if not, would you recommend that they do so?
Yes, thank you. So every member of the House of Commons actually does receive the training and is available to them, including the whips.
Okay. Now, my colleague mentioned how would you define the workplace of members of parliament because of the multiple jurisdictions in which we work. So right now, would we fall under the Ontario Occupational Health and Safety Act, or because of the multiple jurisdictions, where would we fall as members of parliament? Because we could be at an event, we could be traveling, we could be in our constituents, we can be here on the Hill. What jurisdiction do we fall under?
I'm going to refer that to Michelle.
As a member of the federal parliament, your workplace will be governed by the Canada Labour Code Part 2. So that's the authority. Now, traveling, it's possible that there might be some other health and safety regime that will kick in depending on if you have an event in another workplace. But you as an employer and your workplace, the constituency office, is governed by the Labour Code.
Okay. So I have a weird question. It may sound a little weird, but I'm going to give you some context. In May of 2015, the Reform Act amended the Parliament of Canada Act, and it requires that the first caucus meeting after an election, 4 votes must take place, including a vote on the expulsion of a caucus member. Has a legal opinion been sought out to ensure that this is in line with labour laws? For instance, if a member is undergoing harassment and or a victim of harassment, what's to say that if their caucus has passed the Reform Act to allow caucus members to kick out a member of caucus, essentially with 20% of their caucus, how could this amplify harassment or actually even prevent a member from coming forward out of fear of reprisal by being thrown out of caucus?
Thank you for the question. That's indeed a very interesting question. The Reform Act came into force and was implemented before the Labour Code was put in place. I will say my preliminary opinion, they govern different things. As you know, caucus have to decide which portion is to be applicable to their caucus. It applies to the membership, expulsion of members, also leaders may be subject to a vote by their caucus. I would not qualify the exercise of power under the Reform Act as potentially an act of harassment, as members are exercising their right under the Parliament of Canada Act. Same thing when they are participating in proceedings in the House and voting. I'm afraid that's all I could offer today, but that's indeed a very interesting question.
I'm interested to hear your perspectives on the change of culture. It was mentioned that we are a historic adversarial type of workplace, but that doesn't have to necessarily be the case. We have the power to change that. We have the ability to change that. There has to be desire and political will to change that. But I'd like to see, there have been a number of new security programs initiated. Parliamentarians are now offered trial programs through PPS security, off precinct. There's been panic buttons for some time, but all of these things are being added to our constituency office for sure as well. I would like to know observations on the rise of harassment and violence in Canadian politics overall, the deliberations around creating these programs, and what has been the driving force in terms of that increase in incidents.
Maybe, Pat, can I just quickly start and then hand off to you? You're right. There absolutely has been an increase in threats and what have you to members, often anonymous threats through social media or what have you. That's almost a completely separate subject, and Pat can speak to it in terms of what measures have been taken to date to assist members in addressing that. But that is a separate subject from the issue of member-to-member harassment. But I'll let Pat update the committee in terms of what's been done recently and what's up ahead.
I can note that their state...
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. McDonald. I do see that we have bells that have just begun. Colleagues, I'm looking to see if we have unanimous consent to work through the bells, and also if committee members are comfortable voting electronically. That keeps us all here and allows us the opportunity to move forward. But if not, then...
No, I
okay.
Need to vote in person,
No,
but I would be prepared to go 5 minutes until.
Okay, sounds good, colleagues. So we will restart the clock in a moment, and we'll keep an eye out for 5 minutes before votes. Members can, of course, choose to vote electronically or in the chamber. And then once we have all members back, if that happens before 10 minutes, great, we'll get going. And if not, then at the 10-minute mark, we will begin again. Mr. McDonald, apologies for the interruption. Back to you.
Yes, so there's been a significant increase in the last 5 years in harassment of the members of Parliament, mostly online, but also in person and at events, and by significant, probably in the tune of 700-800% increase. And the same for, to give you an example, on threat behaviors towards towards the MPs. In 2019, there was approximately 8 files we opened up on threat behaviors towards either a direct or indirect threat towards an MP, and in 2023, there was 530 files opened. So that's a significant increase of threats and threat behavior, mostly threatening behavior towards the members of Parliament. For the harassment of MPs online, it's come to the point where we're bulk filing the harassment of MPs online. That it's so bulk filing, there's just so much of it, and the social media platforms are, one, either not taking our call or taking our call and saying, yes, we'll look into it, and it ends there. Because it's according to their rules if they take it down, the malicious or harassing posts, and it's up to them to take it down. Anyone can report it in if the post doesn't meet their rules or regs, but it's up to the social media platform to remove it. And we're not having much luck as of late having them remove it.
So that might be a separate question versus member to member. It certainly would have an impact on members. Certainly has an impact on staff. So as an employer, what obligations do we have around that impact?
So 1 minute remaining.
So I think, again, it's about providing a health and safety environment. I think that is the most important. So it's about, if you come and speak to us from an HR perspective, we have resources. We have nurses on site. We have actually a respectful workplace that could support employees, making sure that from a mental state perspective, they feel safe. We have training available. Of course, we're not going to, eliminate it, but it's about mitigating the risk for reoccurrence. So that is an obligation that we do have.
And I guess I don't know if I can get it in. Maybe I can bank my time if the chair is so
about
kind.
20 seconds, Ms. Matheson. Happy to roll it over for next
Thank
round.
you. I request that, sir.
Thank you for this. This is a very interesting study that I have plenty of personal experience with. I'm sure you've seen my name in the bulk files many times. I guess my question to you about when we're talking about online harassment to members or that kind of thing, for you and your team, what do you have in place to support yourself to actually act on this?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we have an open source intelligence unit who employ a number of different softwares. And right now we focus mostly just because of the number of files, which are threats or indirect threats. That's our focus. And we reach out to the police force of local jurisdiction and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the protective operations. Once we feel, or if we feel that there may be criminal intent there.
I guess where I'm going with this is a couple of twofold question. We know our police are extremely inundated, overwhelmed. They also don't have the resources often to follow up, not just in this instance, but in many domestic violence instances. Many issues go sort of left to the bottom of the queue because there is so many other issues, whether it be overdoses or, calls of those kinds of things. So my question is twofold. Number one, I'd be curious to have the data, if you want to table it to the committee, how you've had to change your staffing, and have you had to increase staffing and resources, and what does that cost look like? And in what time frame have you seen that jump? And then also, how do you prioritize if your resources are spread as thin as they are in, say, the instances of police?
Real quick. In terms of police following up, I think what's often frustrating for members, and it's a genuine concern, is, and it's maybe a more legal question, the definition between when harassment becomes a threat and becomes criminal. And that's often a fine line. In terms of staffing, very recently the Board of Internal Economy adopted a significant increase in resources to assist the Sergeant-at-Arms and his team that work closely, of course, with Parliamentary Protective Services and the RCMP and other jurisdictions. So maybe, Pat, you can give a bit of detail on what that will see us have going forward.
So, as the clerk said, there's been a significant investment in my area in the last month to resource us up and keep our nose above the waterline and deal with the massive workload which we are now facing. We're very confident that we'll be able to handle the workload for the foreseeable future. In regards to the cooperation with the police force of jurisdiction, we deal with 91 police forces. We have agreements with 61 to provide paid duty at members' events and provide security when a member hosts or attends a public event. To date, the RCMP have been excellent to move quickly on files that may have a criminal intent or.
What is your key and like what is your timeline that you have as your goal to respond? Do you have one internally that you're saying, okay, we've received this message, we have a timeline that we've put in place for us to follow up?
We try to get our files as quickly as possible. If there's a threat there, we'll same day get to that file. Often within minutes, we get to the file, and sometimes with the cooperation of police force of jurisdiction and the RCMP, we can act on the file the same day. And I had an example of that in recent memory where the threat came in against a member of parliament in the morning, and the person was in custody out west in Western Canada by bedtime.
Your team has been amazing when I've had to reach out, so I do commend you on that. The other major question I think that a lot of people online are having
we're at about 20 seconds.
20 seconds is bots, differentiating between a real person and a bot. What are you doing to ensure that?
Well, that's my open source intelligence team, and I would have to come back to you with an answer because that's getting into technical information that I don't quite understand.
I want to follow up on the line of MP to MP harassment. And when it was asked about social media, I think, Mr. Jantz, you said that's a separate matter or a separate subject, except my question is, what happens when an MP puts on social media something that directly drives harassment of the MP? So they mention another MP specifically in social media, which in turn drives phone calls, emails, and social media threats and misogyny. And I've been subject to that repeatedly. So I would argue it's not a separate subject. And I don't know how we deal with that, but I just wonder if you could talk about the impact of MPs' social media on other MPs.
No, thank you for the clarification, Ms. Damoff, and you're right. When I spoke about social media as separate, I meant like members of the public, anonymous people sending threats and the like, but you're right. Sometimes you have occasions where there is member-to-member exchanges on social media, or what you're alluding to, a member does something that causes an impact then on another member. It again becomes a bit of a jurisdictional issue. For instance, the speaker has jurisdiction in the chamber between interactions between members, but has no jurisdiction over exchanges between members on social media. You know, Michelle, if you want to add to that.
Well, currently, there's no House instruments that will govern this relationship. The Code of Conduct sexual harassment is limited to sexual harassment, as its title indicates, and the policy does not apply to member conduct. Of course, if the tweet or the what is posted on social media reaches a certain threshold that it's criminal harassment, then it will be subject to the criminal code, but we haven't had any example of such a matter.
So I'm not talking about the actual MP and criminal harassment. I'm talking about the MP tweeting, for example, knowing that, with misinformation often, but targeting another MP. So the MP says Pam Demoff has just compared every hunter in Canada to the Danforth shooter. And then what follows from that is the very large gun lobby sending much more than mean tweets, which is what they've called them, but they've been threats and absolutely horrific messages to my office, phone calls from across Canada, which impact my staff. So it's the MPs, what they have tweeted has directly resulted in harassment of my staff and myself. So it's not the MP saying the criminal harassment, it's inciting other people to do so.
Currently, there's nothing, no House policy or code of conduct that will address such a behavior.
Do any other jurisdictions have policies with respect to MP harassment?
Yeah, so there's 9 across legislative around Canada that do, and internationally as well. Both UK and Australia also have an MP to MP.
Would you be able to share those policies with us?
Absolutely.
Okay,
yeah.
thank you. Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about our staff, which Ms. Matheson brought up, because while there are resources available to them, I often hear people say to me, "Well, you don't have to look at your social media," but the problem is somebody is looking at it. My office set up a whole subfolder in our inbox called misogyny. So maybe to this, talk about how this is impacting staff.
Yeah.
In 20 seconds.
We encourage you to actually let us know. And like mentioned earlier, there are mental support for the staff, and we want to make sure that they feel secure themselves. So I would encourage for us, Pat also shares with me whenever there are instances where there are tweets that could harm the staff, and we're proactively reaching out as well to make sure that they're okay.
So where are the boundaries? Like, where does parliamentary privilege end? Can you talk about the principles of how we would decide even upon that? Fine lines, your worries about that as well.
As was alluded to, there are several jurisdictions that do have codes to govern member-to-member behavior, and I think the vast majority of them deliberately and explicitly exclude what goes on in the chamber and in committees. And the goal, I think, in that is to protect the privileges of members in their deliberative functions and ensure that any situations that arise in those forums are dealt with according to the procedures and the rules in those forums. So there's a speaker who is responsible for ensuring decorum in the chamber. There is a chair who is responsible for maintaining decorum in a committee. And there are processes by which the House can sanction misconduct should it occur in those forums. So a lot of, I think the vast majority of codes that other legislatures have adopted have deliberately carved that out with, I think, the fear of what would members welcome, for example, outside investigation into what goes on during proceedings? I guess that's the question that that members would have to decide in considering that.
In terms of those boundaries and what those chairs within the House or committee have, do they have the proper tools already existing to be able to do that job? Do they have the appropriate training to do that job? Is that something that we need to work on as well?
I think that would be a question for members to decide. That there is, I think, certain standards of decorum that are expected and that are attempted to be enforced. Whether members think those standards are sufficiently high, I think, is a question for members to answer. And whether or not the sanctions available to the chairs or to the speaker are sufficiently high, I think, is also a question members could consider.
Decorum is pretty general term and broad term.
Yes.
So again, it comes from an individual's will to abide by those entirely.
Correct. Yes.
And there would be no other option.
I would say if members feel that stronger tools are necessary or stronger sanctions are necessary or different processes are necessary, they would have to incorporate that into the rules. But as multiple speakers have said in multiple rulings about decorum, about language, it's impossible to achieve that, I think, only by enforcement. Members need to have the will to also govern themselves appropriately.
So as a workplace... that was a really fast 3 minutes. Oh.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Colleagues, just a quick note before we go to the next line of questioning here. So we're going to hit just right at 5 minutes. I'm going to suspend at that point. We go vote. Once folks are back, we're going to continue. We will have one more from the Liberal side and then an entire round subsequent to that. And then that will bring us to the end of this morning's testimony. With that, for 5 minutes, I turn it to Ms. Rempel-Garner. Welcome to PROC.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Jantz, has the House ever undertaken a legal analysis of what portions of various labor codes, be it provincial or federal, apply to Parliament or to the workplace of parliamentarians?
It's a good question, Mr. Garner. I'm not aware of any, but maybe Michelle would have some details.
Until changes to the labor code in 2019, which came into force a year or 2 years later through what was known as Bill C-65, which made applicable to amendment to what we call PESRA, the Parliamentary Employment and Staff Relations Act. Prior to these amendments, the health and safety provision of the labor code were not applicable to Parliament as a workplace. That said, there were provisions, policies in place at the administration level, but there was no specific legal requirement except the general legal requirements of employers.
What about provincial labor code?
Provincial labor code will not apply to federal entities. They were really subject to federal legislation, so that's why until amendments were made to PESRA and then to the labor code to make it applicable to parliamentary employers, the provincial labor codes were not applicable.
So if someone was to say that they're entitled to a safe workplace here, parliamentarian, the federal or provincial labor codes would not apply in that sense outside of the amendments that were made in legislation in 2019. Is that correct?
Well, the changes that were made to the legislation in 2019 made applicable Part 2 of the Canada Labor Code almost in entirety with some adjustments, minor adjustment to Parliament as a workplace and to all parliamentary employers, including members.
Thank you. I have made a very purposeful choice in my career to not platform any of the harassment that I've received, and I will continue that. I will say, because it's a matter of public record, that I think I was the first case of criminal harassment that was prosecuted on Twitter writ large. Mr. Janice, your team here has talked about the fact that there are criminal laws regarding harassment. What services do your team offer to link parliamentarians with the appropriate legal services when instances of criminal harassment occur?
It's very much a partnership, I would think. Our Office of the Law Clerk is involved, the Sergeant at Arms Office is involved, our IT folks who are in close contact with some of the cybersecurity institutions are involved, police forces of jurisdiction, Parliamentary Protective Service. So there's a lot of players involved. But maybe, Pat, you want to give a bit more detail?
A typical case would be made aware of the complaint. First contact is RCMP. And second contact with the RCMP is police force of jurisdiction. We reach out to them. The case is discussed. Often it's obvious that it is a criminal harassment case.
At this point, though, it's fairly, it would be reactive, right? So in terms of your team offering those, making MPs aware of like what to do in those circumstances, it's reactive right now. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Perhaps that's something that the committee could consider as a recommendation. I remember a time where a colleague of a different party gave a 5-minute missive in the House of Commons about the fact that I had blocked them on Twitter after they had sent a lot of junk my way. I would just, colleagues, with this 45 seconds, since I'm segueing into this committee, I would just urge colleagues on their recommendations to ensure that we are not using legitimate, if there are recommendations that they're made on legitimate grounds, not as a way to litigate partisanship. And I would hope that whatever recommendations come out of this study, that partisanship is removed and scoring partisan points is removed, because this is a really serious issue.
We're not talking about privilege here when we're talking about closing the loophole with respect to MP harassment. I think, when I talk about privilege, let me rephrase that. What I'm talking about is not having healthy debate in the chamber. I think we should absolutely have healthy debate in the chamber. I think we should absolutely be questioning policies. We should absolutely be providing feedback to improve legislation. But when it comes to sometimes the civility in the House, when it comes to personal attacks, when that kind of behavior then spills out into social media, so that a member now is refraining from either going to the chamber or participating in debate or self-regulating what they say out of fear of all of that happening. Now we're into privilege. Can you comment on that? The fact that if we have members not going into the chamber or not participating in debate out of fear of what's going to come out on social media or their emails or the phone calls to their constituency, we are now prohibiting MPs from participating. And that is a point of privilege. Mr. Jans, can you elaborate a little bit on that?
It's a very good question that you raised, Mr. Romanado. Again, issues of decorum and what flows from that in the chamber, there are, as Jeffrey alluded to a bit earlier in response to a similar question, there are procedures and practices in place to address that. I'm not sure that changing the code would necessarily have a direct impact on that. And again, most jurisdictions carve that out as something to be treated separately. But obviously, no, you would not want to see members refraining deliberately themselves from attending sittings in the House because of fear of what could transpire or happen, either in the House or thereafter, because ultimately that's why they've been elected, is to represent constituents in the chamber. I don't know, Jeffrey, if you wanted to add.
I think we would all share the objective that members should be able to come and speak freely and without fear of consequences, and I think that's the entire concept of parliamentary privilege is meant to protect. The question you raised, though, is a tricky one about when members are then subjected to harassment or targeted for harassment for things that they have said after the fact, and how does one best handle that? And I think, if I understood you correctly, it's not necessarily what they get from other members, it's what they get from the general public, and the types of attacks that are now very easy to make behind one's keyboard in one's basement, and to do so very often anonymously without any consequences. And it's an interesting challenge to how to reduce that risk, and I think the platforms themselves have some responsibility in trying to police that, and I'm not sure if I understood Pat correctly that that's a responsibility they're taking very seriously today.
So I know all of my colleagues here today have gone through this. So in our parliamentary work, whether we're in committee right now, and I'm sure I've probably already got some emails in my inbox based on the questions I'm asking you today. Snowflake, can't take the heat. Oh, maybe, women, can't take it, don't run for office. What would you say to people who are considering this profession, who see what some people post on social media, who see some of the harassment that MPs go through, whether it be at an event, whether it be, in the grocery store? I can't buy ice cream at my grocery store because normally people stop me and they're asking me questions, and by the time I get to the cash, it's melted. And that's actually a good thing. But that being said, when people are thinking about this job, we have a responsibility on the civility in the House as well, whether we have a decorum or not. I think we do have a responsibility as colleagues. Nowhere in any other workplace would some of the behavior that we see be acceptable. Any other workplace in Canada, the person would be terminated. What can you say to people who are considering this profession, given everything that you see that we go through?
About 20 seconds.
It's a very good point. I mean, I think we all find it tremendously unfortunate what members and prospective members are subjected to. I would hope that would not overly discourage people who have an interest in public service from nonetheless putting their name forward and seeking election and making a contribution to Canada and Canada's Parliament. But you're absolutely right. It is a concern for many, and certainly our team, to the best that we can, is there to support and to help.
Mr. McDonald, in your conversations with law enforcement, has there ever been any discussion about the need for clarity in law around what constitutes online criminal harassment, or perhaps additional tools that law enforcement could use, or that there's a gap in right now to de-escalate behavior or to prevent it from escalating.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I don't recall, Madame, having a discussion of that nature with law enforcement partners.
The reason why I ask is because we're having a conversation now on online, essentially the broader issue of online harassment. And I know that the RCMP there was an article, I believe it was in the CBC last week, saying that the RCMP is recommending additional tools for members of Parliament to prevent from harassment. But my reaction to that was, well, if they can't protect me, then how are they protecting everyone else? So I'm just wondering, based on your experience, if you would have any suggestions that the committee could recommend to perhaps close some of those gaps. Like, for example, the fact that it's very difficult at present, or it's gray to understand, like, when and how law enforcement can find the identity of somebody who is repeatedly, and not like one-off, but like repeatedly harassing somebody online in a threatening way that could become criminal, be deemed as criminal harassment.
Yes, I think there's lots to be done, can be done, and should be done in relation to the harassment of members of Parliament, politicians in general, and the general public. When we first started up our open source intelligence unit, we focused on the harassment of members of Parliament, and we had great contacts and on the social media platforms, and would ask them to take down posts that were against their own regulations. Well, in the last few years, that's fallen by the wayside. Sometimes they answer the phone, sometimes they don't, often they don't. I was speaking earlier before we came back about Twitter used to be our best contact for bringing stuff down off of social media. And once the new owner took over, the people, our contacts there, were let go. And now there's nobody to contact at that particular social media platform to bring down information.
At that time, when you talk about bringing down information, did the House have a clearly defined set of guidelines on when they would ask for something to, quote, be brought down? I'm just concerned about...
Yeah, sorry.
It sounds like impingement on speech, potentially.
Well, it was just their regulation, the terms and conditions of the social media platform, if they were breached. And we would only contact the social media platform with the authorization of the MP. We would not go out on our own. But anyone can contact the social media platform.
It seems to me, based on this conversation, that there's a gap between understanding, or there's a gap between what is clear in law in terms of what constitutes online criminal harassment and what tools could be used to either prevent the escalation of that happening when there's a clear pattern of behavior. And I'm not talking about like a single mean tweet or something. I mean like a clear escalation in harassment. And what is actually being used in practice right now. It seems like a bit of a hodgepodge. Would that be a correct assessment? And I'm not saying like ascribing motive, or it seems like there's a lack of clarity in law in this regard.
I would agree.
Thank you. I'll close with this question. Since this committee was last seized with this issue, I think that there was a purposeful decision taken to not include MP harassment in the changes to the Labour Code. Has your shop, Mr. Jantz, given any thought to how non-sexual harassment would be defined? I know that this has already been discussed somewhat today, but has there any thought been given to that by your team?
About 30 seconds, please.
Not considerable, but I think you, Carolyn, might have a standard definition that's often used.
In 30 seconds, I would say there is already in the harassment prevention policy a definition right now that we could definitely be reviewing. But there's always the Canadian Human Rights Act, right, that we can actually look back on and make sure that we're taking the best of the definition and putting it forward.
The code that already exists for harassment and violence in the workplace, Appendix 1, and I find it very thorough, but it is clear there that harassment may include, but is not limited to, offensive or intimidating comments or jokes. There's another point about abuse of authority, which doesn't apply here because this has to do with employers and employees. But it goes on to say, spreading malicious rumors or gossip about an individual or group, cyberbullying, threatening, spreading rumors or negatively talking to or about someone online or on social media, socially excluding or isolating someone, persistently criticizing, undermining, belittling, demeaning, or ridiculing a person, psychological harassment. I'm picking out the ones that I think are most pertinent to our discussion here today. Sexist remarks, racist remarks, homophobic remarks, transphobic remarks, verbal threats or intimidation, and so on, making aggressive, threatening, or rude gestures. Harassment is not, and the first point has to do with management responsibilities, but the second point, very pertinent to our discussion today, harassment is not a disagreement regarding a policy or practice. So I would ask you, does this constitute a good basis to address this gap in the member-to-member code of conduct, if you will, regarding non-sexual harassment?
I would say yes, but there's definitely a study to be done in the context of the environment.
Excellent, because I think what we've heard today are examples, too, of how social media, which is a tool for all of us, is being weaponized, effectively weaponized by members, and in some cases our social media accounts are actually paid for by the House of Commons, so it does come under the purview of our MOB, or our staff operate our social media accounts, so they're salaried staff there, and we can talk about, I appreciated the points that Ms. Matheson made. We can talk about the effects of staff both in dealing with social media and also producing harassment media. So is what I'm hearing that this gap really has to do with, it's one thing what is governed within the House of Commons by the Speaker or in committee by chairs, but once it leaves this House by the vehicle of social media, and this is what is brand new, is this not an area where it behooves us to put a policy into place? I'm thinking, Monsieur Bedard, too, historically, in the House of Commons, we have two sword lengths, do we not, between the opposing side? Because there was a time that physical violence, and God forbid, I hope we never get to that point again, but the two sword lengths, I think we need to talk about putting preventive barriers around the use of social media. Mr. Bedard, would there be something legislatively that would cover that otherwise?
1 minute remaining here.
Mm-hmm.
With respect to the two swords, we haven't taken any measurements recently. You alluded to some definition of harassment and examples. The definitions you alluded is actually in the labor code, and these were examples. Now, whether to the code of conduct, sexual harassment, or general harassment, if members want to start from the existing definition of harassment, which is applicable in the federal workplace, and adjust it to the savor of Parliament, because there is a unique component to Parliament as a workplace, the House of Commons. We mentioned parliamentary proceedings. Also, we need to be mindful of the fact that there are about half of the chamber that is called the opposition. You don't have that in any regular workplace. So, and the main role of the opposition is to oppose, to make sure that the government is accountable. You don't have that in a normal workplace as well. So any measures that are to be put in place, if any, have to take into consideration the unique nature of the role of government, opposition in our system of government.
I have two big questions, unfortunately, within 2.5 minutes. So there's a concern of mine that as we try to move forward, and maybe this would be for the subcommittee to talk about, but to get the opinions of members of Parliament on how we start to deal with these issues. Obviously, we want that to be protected. Do you have any advice for this committee on how that could happen in terms of ensuring that even former members who are not reoffering, current members can be protected in terms of anonymity? If we start to survey them, is there a mechanism in place that could do that on this issue? The other question that I'll squeeze in there is I wanted to ask about witnesses. We are seeing witnesses not come forward as much at committee. We are also seeing this clipping culture, these gotcha politic moments that are now turning on members of academia or those incredible stakeholders that we rely so much upon. What can we do to better protect them? They are protected under privilege, and yet when they leave here, their testimony is used against them to a point where they may not return, and that's really quite critical. So I'd like your opinions on that.
Maybe I'll start and others can jump in. In terms of a process of consulting either current members or past members, certainly that's one of the tools that's available to any committee in terms of how extensive consultations want to be undertaken. There might be a need for caucus consultations, see what each caucus has in terms of views. Your point about witnesses is a good one. Obviously, witnesses are a key component to committee proceedings and the testimony that they provide, and any actions that result in a chilling effect and discourage them from volunteering to come before a committee to provide their advice and their expertise is certainly a preoccupation.
Do those witnesses have any redress if things happen to them in that regard? There's no access to parliamentary privilege or parliamentary resources like we have in the same instance?
We have in recent years, very quickly, we have very recently started to make available to witness some supports, especially witnesses who come forward. I don't know it's necessarily the situation you're describing, but witnesses who come forward in the context of very difficult studies, very emotional studies, where there's something very traumatic that they come to share, where we've been making available to them the same sorts of supports that would be available to members or other members of the House administration, but it's a relatively limited thing at present. In terms of retribution, any sort of retribution against a witness for testimony they give could be punished as a breach of privilege. The expectation is that witnesses come here to share information so that Parliament can do its job, and anybody who seeks to silence them or to punish them for that is doing a disservice to Parliament and to the democratic exercise. But how does that actually occur? What does one do in order to ensure that they're protected is challenging, especially like what we're used to seeing is the sort of idea of reprisals from their employer, or like if you're a whistleblower and then you're sanctioned for coming forward, but then to be then subject to attacks in the public sphere online. I think it's a different order, and it's maybe not something we're as familiar with or as well equipped to deal with at the moment.
A lot of has been said about missing or gaps, missing rules or regulations or so on, but I just want to get a clear state of where we actually are. So notwithstanding the labor code issues and everything that's been brought up, we already do have criminal sanctions for harassment. We have criminal sanctions for hate speech in the criminal code. We also have civil law dealing with libel and or slander, which I'm not sure has been fully tested when it comes to parliamentary privilege. So in the context of those provisions being there, we also have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is premised largely upon the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which gives us freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And at what point do we encroach on parliamentary privilege, on freedom of rights, and including freedom of expression, and why aren't the other mechanisms that I talked about, the criminal sanctions and the civil sanctions, enough to govern this space?
It's a very good question, and I think would be probably a focus of a large part of the discussion of either this committee or a subcommittee as to definitions and boundaries. You're right, there's a lot that exists right now, but what I think we're sensing from some of the comments that have been made to date is that that is perhaps not sufficient, and there's maybe something in between that should be codified.
Perhaps. I'm not saying that. Is it an enforcement issue? Is it a resource issue? Is it an actual lack of rules or laws issue? I guess that's the nature of my question.
Thank you for the question. The various instruments you refer to, the criminal code, libel, slander, they have specific threshold, and those thresholds that are applicable will not be the same that will apply to harassment. The threshold for harassment in the workplace will be different. So you first will meet the threshold for harassment, then civil liability, and then criminal liability. One thing that I will add too, because you mentioned parliamentary privilege and that it hasn't been tested, even the criminal code makes explicit provision that hate speech provision do not apply to words that are spoken in the chamber. Same thing for legal action that will be, civil legal action that will be taken against a member or witness before for what they've said during the proceedings will be excluded, will be dismissed.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Michelle. I really do. But if something is spoken in the chamber, something is spoken in a committee, and it is republished on a social media platform, has that been clarified insofar as the tests of privilege and libel and or slander?
This will depend on the circumstances, and you're correct that there's no major ruling addressing the issue. If it's a exhaustive reproduction of parliamentary proceedings, there will be a common law protection that will apply, and it will be an absolute protection. If it's only an abstract of the proceedings that are republished, that will depend on the circumstances and the intention of the person who did the publication.
And would anybody like to weigh in on the public interest that's also at stake in this conversation about being able to disseminate information that happens during our parliamentary proceedings, and whether or not we should be including the public interest in this conversation?
I alluded earlier to the absolute common law protection for the publishing of the entire proceedings of the House, which is based on the public interest, the fact that people have a public interest to know what is taking place in Parliament, in committee. Same thing for when it's an abstract or partial reproduction. There is an exception that is made in the law that if the person did that reproduction in good faith, there will be a protection afforded. So I will say that yes, there is a general interest for the public to see what its representatives are doing to vote laws to make sure that the government is accountable.
Thank you, Chair. I want to talk about physical safety in constituency offices. Recently, we got a notice from the Sergeant-at-Arms to keep our offices closed. My office is closed all the time now, except by appointment, on recommendation from Parliamentary Protective Services, and there's a sign on the door to that effect. But in particular, we got a notice a few weeks ago about climate Axe the Tax demonstrations, and that was something the Leader of the Opposition had called for the public to go to MPs' offices to demonstrate, and then shortly afterwards we get a notice that we're to make sure that we're vigilant, to keep the doors locked. How dangerous is that type of call by politicians to act, and then it results in us as MPs being less accessible and also putting our staff in danger in community offices.
Yeah, so I was the one, as a sergeant at arms, that sent that memo out on that particular day to keep the offices locked. It wasn't related to what a political party here published. We picked it up off the intent to visit MP offices. We picked that up from a group who had posted on the internet that it was their intent to visit members of Parliament offices and protest. So that's why that was published. And also we picked up off the open source monitoring the possibility of demonstrating at residences of members of Parliament. And indeed, over the past months, there have been demonstrations at certain members of Parliament residences.
Ms. Matheson talked about the difficulty in getting witnesses, and I've experienced that as well. When we were studying Bill C-21, we also had death threats being given to officials, so members of the civil service, nonpartisan members of the public service who appeared, and the chair of the committee had to warn the Conservative members to tone down the type of the way they were questioning these officials, because it was directly impacting their safety. When Ms. Shanahan read the definition of harassment, it included, cyberbullying, spreading of malicious rumors. Should that not apply to MPs and our behavior as well?
It's a very good question, and again, I think something that the committee and a potential subcommittee would want to think long and hard about. It's that line, I guess, between the genuine need to be as free as possible to express views and play the role of either a government member or an opposition member, versus, to your point, the right to have a healthy work environment for members, their staff, anybody else who sets foot on Parliament Hill. It's a very difficult question.
If you don't, I wanted to talk a little bit more about staff, because it's becoming more difficult as an MP to not only hire staff but retain staff because of the abuse that they're receiving in offices. The phone calls, for example, mostly in the community office, but they also read about what's going on and they see social media, and it's becoming difficult to retain people, understandably, despite services that you offer. It's first of all, they're not. They just shouldn't be subjected to this in any way, shape, or form. Do you want to comment maybe on the retention and hiring difficulties that MPs are facing?
Got about 30 seconds here.
There's a talent war out there, so I would say it's not limited to MPs, but definitely the environment would definitely contribute more if they are seeing it both on social media or in committees or. But I would say at this point I would always encourage to come back and maybe reach out to us just to make sure that there are some preventative measures that are put in place for employees to just ensure that they're feeling safe both mentally and physically. I would just urge to contact us.
Merci. Okay, colleagues, that concludes the first panel for today's portion of our study. I would like to thank Mr. Leblanc, Mr. McDonnell, Mr.